Hey, welcome back to part three of our series on Indiana University in the Civil War. So in part one, we talked about the antebellum period leading up to secession, what life was like in Bloomington and on campus, and what the experiences were of some of our students and faculty. In part two, we talked about the war itself, from secession to Appomattox, up to Appomattox. We didn't talk about Appomattox. We're going to include that today in part three. So if you haven't yet seen those, go back and watch those and check those out. And we'll be sure to put a link at the end so you can go back and see that. But today we're going to talk about Appomattox forward and kind of what was the impact of the Civil War on the university. If you want a more detailed overview of the surrender at Appomattox, check out our video that's specifically on this topic. But otherwise, we're going to review a little bit of it in the next couple of slides. Now, if you've ever seen any paintings, drawings, accounts of the surrender at Appomattox, you'll know that you'll notice one really interesting thing about it. Almost all the accounts have a ton of people in blue and just two people in gray. And that's fairly well documented that there were only two people from the Confederacy, General Robert E. Lee and Charles Marshall, his personal secretary slash chief of staff type of person who came with him that were there. That they may have also had a horseman assistant that was kind of outside with their horses and stuff. But those were the only Confederates that were there, and there was a whole swarm of Union officers that were there, senior officers, junior officers of all kinds that were there during the surrender. So that makes it all the more interesting that Indiana University was one of only two schools that were represented on both sides during the surrender. So William McKee Dunn, who we talked a little bit about before, and also has his own separate video. It's not labeled with his name. It's labeled under IU History on the DC Metro. But be sure to check that one out if you want to learn more about him. But William McKee Dunn, by this point, was serving as an aide in the command staff of the Union Army. And he was actually one of the two folks that was sent out to find General Lee when word came that General Lee was interested in surrendering. So Dunn goes out, they find General Lee sitting under an apple tree. This is kind of a famous story that comes from the period. And they then ride with him and Colonel Charles Marshall to find a suitable location, and they find the McLean farmhouse, and that's where they end up doing the surrender at. And Dunn is there. He's not a senior enough officer at that point. He's not a brigadier general. He's not even a colonel. He's just a captain. And so he would have probably been standing outside, but he definitely rode up to the surrender with Lee and Marshall, and that's fairly well documented. And of course, Marshall had been a faculty member at IU. And so given this really small number of Confederates that are there, it's really interesting that IU and West Point are two of the only two schools I've been able to confirm are represented on both sides at that surrender. And I think, again, it sort of says the reach of IU, the power of IU, that movers and shakers of this time period were very much connected to what was going on. Of course, William McKee Dunn goes on to have a career in the Army long after this, becomes Judge Advocate General of the Army, and goes on to be a Brigadier General. So also important during this time period is James Rollins. And James Rollins is a border state congressman from Missouri. And we actually have a whole separate video about him, and I'm going to flash to that here in a second, so you'll be able to find it. But in short, Rollins is a slave owner who, when Missouri frees its slaves, Abraham Lincoln comes to Rollins and says, I really need your help getting the 13th Amendment passed. And Rollins's support from a conservative border state standpoint helps get the 13th Amendment passed, and Lincoln credits him with passing the 13th Amendment. And so Rollins in and of himself is just a fascinating person. He's very complex. Every time I think I figured something out about him, I figure out that I'm wrong. So he had been a major in the Black Hawk War, and so he is known as Major Rollins for much of the rest of his life. And one of the things that he says when he's getting the 13th Amendment passed is that an anti-slavery man in sentiment, and yet heretofore a large owner of slaves myself, and not now, however, not exactly with my consent, but with or without my consent, I learned from a telegram a morning or two ago that the convention recently assembled in my state adopted an amendment to our present constitution for the immediate emancipation of all the slaves in the state. I am no longer the owner of a slave, and I thank God for it. If giving up my slaves without complaint shall be a contribution upon my part to promote the public good, to uphold the Constitution of the United States, to restore peace and preserve this Union. If I had owned 1,000 slaves, they would most cheerfully have been given up. I say with all my heart, let them go, but let them not go without a sense of feeling and a proper regard on my part for the future of themselves and their offspring. Now, a lot of his writing in this time period sort of shifts, and he switches from talking about slaves and the Confederacy and slavery law issues to talking about the offspring of slaves. And that hasn't gone unnoticed on his family as well. And there's a lot of effort and money and research that's being put into why this sudden shift happened as well. And if you want to learn more about Rollins and hear some more quotes and stuff from him and the complexity that is him, please check out the video, James S. Rollins, that's on our YouTube channel. Rollins House in Wright Quad is named after him. And so it's kind of filmed right outside of there. So check it out if you want to learn a little bit more. So one of the other things that happens during the Civil War is that the Land Grant Act is passed. And the Land Grant Act created land grant schools. So that's where you get your Auburns, your Mississippi States, your Purdue's, a number of those schools that come into being. And one of the requirements of the Land Grant Act is that those schools have to teach agriculture and mechanics and military science. So the Army spends a lot of time trying to figure out how to get officers to teach military science, and they send a lot of second lieutenants straight out of West Point to go teach military science at these schools. And then other schools that were not land grant schools said, hey, what about us? We want to teach military science as well. And so in the end, Congress tells the Army that they can pick 10 other schools and they need to send instructors to 10 other schools. And IU is one of those schools that's chosen. And the first instructor we get after the Civil War is Major General Eli Long. So being a Major General, of course, two-star general, he is the senior most military science instructor out of all of these folks. He's got a ton of second lieutenants, and there's a captain and a colonel here and there. But General Long is by far the senior most instructor out of all the folks that are tasked with this. So that tells you a little bit like IU is this place they saw as important enough to send the senior most instructor that they had in order to go do this and teach there. Now, Long's only here a year before he gets recalled back to do work for the Army, and he gets replaced with James Thompson. So James Thompson came, he was teaching military science and civil engineering. Little known fact, IU used to have a civil engineering program. And so Thompson was in charge of that. He was a lieutenant colonel, and he was also the senior most military science instructor that the Army had sent out. And so while he was working here, he actually retired from the Army and continued to teach mathematics after he retired from the Army and was no longer teaching military science. And military science by the 1870s had really started to fade at the university. There was a culture war thing. I'm not going to get into all this. It was kind of happening between land grant schools and universities, research, liberal arts universities. And so military science was seen as something for the land grant schools, not for doctors and lawyers and all the other folks that the liberal arts schools were producing. And so enrollment just declined. It was always an elective, and less people got involved. So by 1876, James Thompson is no longer teaching military science. He was just teaching mathematics. Now, briefly, James Thompson's son, John Thompson, attended IU for a year before going to West Point. John Taliaferro Thompson would go on to be a brigadier general by World War I. And John Thompson is most famous as an armorer and the inventor of the Thompson submachine gun. So that was James Thompson's son and a former IU student. So in part 2, I said I would come back to this, and so I'm coming back to it now. I mentioned that we'd talk about John Foster and Walter Gresham. Now, keep in mind, Foster Quad has Gresham Dining Hall in it. So even on our campus, these two are still linked together. But what's really fascinating is John Foster becomes Secretary of State under President Benjamin Harrison in 1892. And then when Grover Cleveland is elected, he goes across party lines and gets Walter Q. Gresham and asks him to be Secretary of State. And so they are back-to-back Secretaries of State. In fact, when Gresham is on his way to D.C. to take office, Foster had already left and was staying in New York at the time. Gresham goes out of his way to go visit John Foster on his way to Washington, D.C. to become Secretary of State. So they know of each other. They're both very involved in politics. They're both very aware of things that are going on. They are the flip sides of the U.S. Seizing and capture of Hawaii. So John Foster, unbeknownst to him, some folks in the State Department had conspired with some local military folks to overthrow the government of Hawaii and declare Hawaii a republic, and Hawaii comes to him to redress it, but it's as he's leaving office, so he kind of hands it over to Gresham, and Gresham gets stuck trying to undo the damage that has happened in Hawaii. And so, I always love playing this game that I call the 6 degrees of separation from IU, and how you can relate anything back to an IU person or something IU connected. And I've actually had people go, yeah, well, what about, I don't know, Hawaii? And I'm like, oh, that's an easy one. It's kind of interesting to see how these things happen. Both Foster and Gresham were involved in veterans issues after the war as well. Both would have political careers, Gresham largely as a judge, Foster as an ambassador and Secretary of State. And so Foster would also later go on to be on the first Carnegie Endowment for Peace, and was known as a peace activist and involved in a number of peace commissions and things that happened around the world. Much like with any war, we had Civil War veterans that came to IU to go to school after the war. And in fact, they continued on for some number of years after the war, particularly with the law program. However, George Reinhard was our last Civil War veteran that we know of that graduated from IU. And because he took a very circuitous route to get there to happen, he graduated from IU in 1899. Quite a few years after the Civil War. So quick rundown on Reinhard. So he immigrated to the U.S. from Bavaria at the age of 14 in 1857. And he served in the 15th and 16th Indiana during the Civil War. After the Civil War, he went to Miami University in Ohio for 2 years, but didn't graduate. And left to practice law. Back then, you could just go study law and eventually pass the bar. You study under a lawyer, and then you'd be able to take the bar. So he did that. He passed the bar. He eventually became a judge. And in 1896, he actually became a faculty member in the IU Law School, having been a judge and a lawyer for quite a while at that point. And he decided that he needed to finish that bachelor's degree. And so in 1899, he was awarded his bachelor's degree from Indiana University. He was 56 years old at that point. And it's a good thing we did, because 3 years later, he became dean of the law school, now that he had that bachelor's degree. And in 1903, he became vice president of Indiana University. So he actually died while still acting as dean and vice president in 1906. So Reinhard was our last known Civil War alum, or last known Civil War veteran to get a bachelor's degree from IU. So a little more sort of general things that happened. The Alexander Memorial, which is on the courthouse square in downtown Bloomington, in Monroe County Courthouse Square. Currently there's a restoration project going on about it, but the Alexander Memorial, which went up in the 1920s, was part of the Alexander family, Williamson Martin Alexander, who was around the university and did a lot, even did some student housing for the university in the latter half of the 1800s, but never actually graduated or appears to have ever enrolled truly in the university. Was who it's named after. But the Alexander family, of course, is very IU connected. And there's a whole other video about the Alexander Memorial. Feel free to check it out and learn a little bit more about them and their connections. But the crossover between research that was done at the time of the Alexander Memorial about veterans and their role in the 1800s, particularly the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, crosses over well with a lot of IU history of the period. And so I have the advantage of having been on the Restoration Committee for the Alexander Memorial, so having access to that history gave me access to a lot of IU history, and the two sort of blend together. It's also worthy of note that after the Civil War, we had a large number of African-American veterans who settled in the Monroe County area. And so this is at least a partial list of who some of them were. And as you can see, that many of them came from units in Tennessee and Kentucky. They likely, and only a few of them came from units in Indiana. They probably weren't residents of Indiana before the war, but then settled here after the war. And so one of my future research projects is I'd love to track down the experiences and lives of these veterans in the community, and whether or not they have descendants that still live here in the community, and what their lives were like. But they were part of that group of veterans that came back after the war, and you really sort of see a boom in the university and in Bloomington and Monroe County economy that happens after that for a number of reasons, a number of industries, everything from furniture manufacturing to just being a railroad hub and other things that are happening. But that's a future research project in and of itself. And this is where I turn into professor mode to give you a few extra readings if you are interested in those. These are some of my favorites that I've read during this, and these names you'll recognize from the series that I've just done. So there's a great book on William McKee Dunn that was written by William Wesley Woolen. Please feel free to check it out. Probably my favorite in the series is Matilda Gresham's Life of Walter Quentin Gresham, because she's known him almost her entire life, and he'd already passed away by this point, but she uses his letters and his publications and writings and his decrees as a judge and everything else, and she mixes in a little bit of her own life and experience. It's really an engaging read, and it's actually a 2-volume series as you find it most of the time. James Sidney Rollins, super complex individual, owned slaves, passed the 13th Amendment at the same time, like what leads to that. So there's a good series on him. The John Foster book, War Stories for My Grandchildren, you'll probably have a hard time finding outside of the IU library or the IU archives. But it is worth a read if you're able to get a hold of that. And it does focus solely on his time in the Civil War, but it's very much a soldier's chronicle. He talks about the challenges of being away from his wife and being sad and missing his wife and how he wants to get home to visit her. He talks about, being the first unit into Knoxville. He writes a firsthand account of the Battle of Corinth and the siege, and it's like a day-by-day sort of chronicle about what's happening. It's really a good read, and really he talks about camp life and the challenges of wearing wool uniforms and living in, tents during the rainy season and cold weather and all this. And as somebody who spent quite a bit of time in the military myself, like I could really relate to that as I read through that. And then if you want to read about the complicated lives of the Wise family, particularly Obadiah Jennings Wise, then The End of an Era by John S. Wise will be helpful as well. And John Sargent Wise, the author of that, is the younger brother of Obadiah Jennings Wise. So he isn't biased, or is biased, isn't unbiased in his accounting of that story, but it's still an interesting read as well. So thanks for sticking with us through this three-part series on IU in the Civil War. If you watch through the whole thing, you're probably running about 120, 125 minutes or so now. So if you want to add to that, go back and watch those extra videos that we put in there. And I'm going to throw a link up to some of those videos somewhere on here. I'm also going to hit the subscribe button for our channel. So you can go back and see any other videos that we've done, but please check out our channel, some of the other videos that we've talked about. You may also find some other IU history pieces that are interesting to you as well. So thanks again for watching and for sticking with us, and we'll be back at some point in the future with more IU history.